I think networking is a dangerous term. It feels so artificial, and it feels like you always have this other agenda in mind, that you want to get something from people. And people don't like to talk to people who are trying to take advantage of them.
Yeah.
So I think the best advice I can give you is to really care about the people who you work with and to care about the people who you're meeting with as human beings, not just as sort of professional contacts. And then you're going to have more fun, and B, you'll be more successful.
Welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the Silicon Valley, where unicorns roam and innovation never sleeps. We've got top investors, superstar founders, and well-known tech executives lined up to share their secrets on building and investing in successful companies. Just a quick disclaimer, while we may sound like financial geniuses, but please don't mistake us for your friendly neighborhood financial advisors. So let's get started and dive into the wild world of tech entrepreneurship. Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As I expressed previously, I'm a huge fan of your book. And so today I want to get to know you a little bit as a person. You had such a great career as an author, as well as you founded a company in the past like Juice Software and your current company, Radical Candor. And as well as you work with top leader at Google, such as Sheryl Sandberg and Larry Page. So today I want to hear your end of the story on how you started and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My business career was one giant plan to subsidize my novel writing habit. So I came at all of this from kind of an unusual perspective. My first management experience actually began when I was living and working in Moscow. And I was hired by a diamond cutting company to set up a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. And I believed that the whole trick to management was sort of boring. I thought it was just about paying people. And I thought it would be easy in Russia because I had dollars, they had rubles. Rubles were worthless, dollars were worthless, I thought it would. And so I went and talked to these workers expecting they would jump at the chance to come work for me, but no, they wanted a picnic. So this surprised me, but picnic is not hard either. So I went with him on a picnic. And by the end of a bottle of vodka, I realized that what they really wanted was not so much money, but they wanted to know that their boss gave a damn. They wanted to know that if things went south in Russia, someone would help get them and their families out. And that was really the beginning of my management career. I realized that management was actually kind of interesting. It was about helping people achieve their dreams, and who doesn't want to do that? So that was the beginning. That was the very beginning. And then I went to business school and I did a couple of failed startups. And after the second one was failing, I called a classmate of mine from business school, Sheryl Sandberg, and I said, what should I do next? And she said, fly to California and come work at Google. And Google worked out a lot better than those two failed startups, luckily. But I got to the point after about 6 years there that I realized that I didn't really care about cost per click. That wasn't what was getting me out of bed in the morning, although that was what I was responsible for at a certain point. What really motivated me was, again, this question of management. And so I started looking around how to make thinking very consciously about what managers do and how they can do it better. I wanted that to be my full-time job. And there wasn't a job like that at Google at that time, but Steve Jobs at Apple had decided that he wanted to start Apple University and to really think about what management meant and how to teach managers how to be better managers. And Apple University had decided they were going to throw away all the management training they had and start from scratch. So this seemed like an interesting opportunity. So I left Google and I went to Apple and helped design managing at Apple. And then meanwhile, a friend of mine from Google became CEO of Twitter.
Mhm.
And he called me up and he said, why don't you help me build a class called Managing at Twitter? And lo and behold, managing at Twitter was pretty much the exact same thing as managing at Apple, managing at Google, or managing at a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. The core aspects of management were the same thing. And that was what really inspired me to write the book and to become a CEO coach. As I was writing the book, I wanted to test out my ideas. And I was very lucky that Dick Costello hired me to be his CEO coach. And then so did Ryan Smith at Qualtrics and Drew Houston at Dropbox. So I had some great opportunities to test the ideas out in the book as I wrote. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think it's such a legendary story. I love it. A couple things I'm really curious about. So number one is I feel like those really great like operating experiences that you had as a leader and as a startup founder. I think you also have quite a great like network and then the ability to like maintain that network. I hope to learn more about what are some strategies or like some actionable tips for founders. Like how would you expand your network as well as like keeping it like active?
Yeah, my friend Karen Wickery wrote a book called Taking the Work Out of Networking. So first thing I would do is I would read Karen Wickery's book, but also I would think of it not in terms of networking, but in terms of getting to know people who are interesting. Like I think networking is a dangerous term because it feels so artificial, and it feels like you always have this other agenda in mind, that you want to get something from people. And people don't like to talk to people who are trying to take advantage of them.
Yeah.
So I think the best advice I can give you is to really care about the people who you work with and to care about the people who you're meeting with as human beings, not just as sort of professional contacts. And then you're going to have more fun, and B, you'll be more successful.
Absolutely. I love that. You have coached so many great leaders. And you are technically a great leader yourself, as well as like a great author. So what are some skills or characteristics do you think these people share in common? And what should young people do to kind of acquire some skills that like you feel like it's really makes a good leader? And also, what are some characteristics all these people share that you would be looking for in someone working for you or like have any sort of like partnership with you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that I struggled with when I started writing Radical Candor is answering succinctly the question, what do managers do? And by the way, when I talk about managers and leaders, I don't like to draw a big distinction between the two. As far as I'm concerned, management and leadership are like forehand and backhand. You got to be able to do both. So what do managers do? It's tempting to say they go to meetings and they send a lot of email, right? But that's not the job. That's not the job. So what is the job? I think the job is threefold. You want to create a culture of feedback. You want to build cohesive teams, and you want to get stuff done. So those three jobs: feedback, team, results. And so what are the skills that you need to develop in order to be great at feedback, to be great at building a team, and to be great at helping a group of people get stuff done together? I think at the center of it all is the ability to form good relationships with the people who you're working most closely with. And I think this is tricky because the relationship between boss and employee, it is a real human relationship, but it has a terrible reputation in the world. When you think about it, you think about Dilbert, you think about all these sort of horrible, you think about The Office. And so how can you rethink this relationship so that it is a positive relationship? And I think if you become the boss, one of the most important things that you can learn to do is to lay your power down. Because one of the most damaging things to a human relationship is a power imbalance. And so how can you lay your power down and really get to know people at a human level? And this is at the core of what Radical Candor is. Radical Candor is caring personally about each of the people who you work with at the same time that you're willing to challenge them directly. That's what radical candor is. It's also useful to define radical candor by what it isn't. So sometimes we remember to challenge directly, but we forget to show we care personally. That is obnoxious aggression. And very often, I used to call that the asshole quadrant, but I stopped doing that. And I stopped doing it for a very important reason, because then people would start to use the radical candor framework like another Myers-Briggs personality test. And I beg of your listeners, don't do that. Use it like a compass to guide conversations with the people you work with to a better place. So, problem with obnoxious aggression is very often when we land there, instead of moving the right way on the care personally dimension of radical candor, we move the wrong way on challenge directly. And we're in a place where we're neither caring nor challenging. And that is manipulative insincerity, the very worst place of all. And it's fun to tell stories about manipulative insincerity and obnoxious aggression at work. And in fact, the HBO TV show Silicon Valley mocked radical candor. And what they were really talking about, of course, was obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity. Because that's where the drama of workplace sort of cultures gone awry comes from. But the vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes when we do remember to show that we care. We really don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. And because we don't want to hurt their feelings, we fail to challenge them directly. And that is what I call ruinous empathy. So I think the most important thing that you can do as you're developing your management skills, your leadership skills, is to begin to distinguish between radical candor, obnoxious aggression, manipulative insincerity, and ruinous empathy, and to try to learn how to change some deeply ingrained habits of not saying the thing you need to say.
Yeah, I love that it's a really thought through answer, and I love it. So I'm just curious about, at your work, you gave a lot of really, really great examples on what like a great manager is. I specifically remember I think your co-founder Ross was like managing teams at Google, and basically he like had to sit down listening to from like people's kindergarten experience and know all these great things. So you also mentioned about like, you were managing people at Juice. You thought you were not really giving people harsh feedbacks, but eventually led to a bad management result that like your other team member may not really think you are able to manage this company. And I think those are absolutely great. And in terms of like, when you were writing your book, like when did you started planning out the book, and like when did you started out taking notes on the management, and how did the learning journey started for yourself as a leader?
I think, as for most people when they become managers, mostly it was the school of hard knocks. I got it wrong, I failed, and then I learned from my failure and hopefully got it right the next time. In the book, I tell a story about managing this guy, we'll call him Bob. And I really liked Bob. This is and the story I'm about to tell you about is a story of ruinous empathy. And it is the most common mistake that managers make. So I think it's worth taking a minute to tell the story here. So Bob was smart, he was charming, he was funny. I liked Bob so much. And, he would do stuff like, we were at a manager offsite and we were all stressed out. It was a startup. We were all really busy. Nobody felt like they had time to be playing this get to know you game that we were playing. And Bob was a guy who had the courage to raise his hand and say, look, I can tell everybody's really stressed out, and I've got an idea. It's really fast and it'll help to get to know each other. Whatever his idea was, if it was really fast, we were down with it. And so then Bob says, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. Really weird, but really fast. Weirder yet, we all remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So we all loved Bob. He brought a little levity to the office. One problem with Bob. he was doing terrible work. And I couldn't understand why. He had this incredible resume, this history of great accomplishments. I learned much later the problem was that Bob was smoking pot in the bathroom 4 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy. But anyway, I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that Bob was doing terrible work, and he would hand stuff into me. There was shame in his eyes. He knew he wasn't doing very good work. And because I liked Bob and I didn't want to hurt his feelings, would say something along the lines of, oh, Bob, this is such a great start. You're so smart. You're so awesome. Maybe you can make it just a little bit better. And of course, he never did. This goes on for 10 months. And eventually the inevitable happens. All his colleagues are frustrated by him. They're frustrated. Their deliverables are late because his deliverables are late. And I realized that I'm going to lose all my best performers if I don't fire Bob. So I sit down to start a conversation with Bob that I should have started, frankly, 10 months previously. And when I finished speaking, Bob kind of pushed his chair back from the table. He looked me right in the eye and he said, why didn't you tell me? And as that question is going around in my head with no good answer, he says, why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me. And now I realized that I had failed Bob in a bunch of different ways. I had failed to solicit feedback from Bob. Maybe I was doing something that was frustrating him so much, he was forced to toke up in the bathroom 3 times a day. I don't know, because I never solicited feedback from him. I failed to give him feedback. I failed to give him both praise. I didn't tell what the kind of praise I gave him was really just a head fake. And I failed to give him criticism. I failed to tell him when his work wasn't nearly good enough. And last of all, I failed to create the kind of environment in which everyone on the team would give Bob praise that was meaningful, would tell him what was genuinely good about working with him, and also would tell him when he was heading off the rails, when he was going off the rails. And because I had failed Bob in all these different ways, just trying to be nice, I was having to fire him because of it. Not so nice after all. And so these are the kinds of moments that when I sat down to write the book really came to my mind. I hadn't taken notes on these moments, but when I created the space in my life to just have a few hours every day to reflect on experiences I had, these are the kinds of stories that came to mind. So there wasn't like research or a real formal process. It was really just sort of sifting through memories of mostly of mistakes I had made, and how could I how could I tell these stories in a way that helped other people avoid making the same mistakes?
I think your story is really resonating with most of the founders because they're probably first time hiring someone, or they have to instantly managing a team that's probably even more senior than them. I feel like your struggle was really relatable. But I think one thing about that is, like, if you're giving a lot of people feedbacks, I feel like maybe you're hiring the wrong person in the first place if you have to think of like different ways to giving them feedbacks. So curious on if you have a startup and then you don't have many choices on who you're going to hire because of your resources is limited. What are some like realistic strategies to kind of like make it work to giving people feedback that's not harsh enough to make them feel they have to leave or something? And also one of the really interesting part about the story, your co-founder Ross, he was sort of like giving feedbacks or listening to employee feedbacks at Google. I think Google have the ability to hire a lot of people, sort of like train them and then making them start their spirulina farm or something. But as a startup, if I'm a just startup founder, I need the next 3 to 5 years, like to, work passionately with this small group of people. How do I solve the problem of giving people a realistic feedback and helping them grow, but also helping my startup to not fail in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's really, really a great question. So one thing I'd like to say is that even if you hire the very most talented person in the whole world, you still need to talk to them. Like, I think a big mistake that people make about management is they think, I'm just going to hire the right people And then if I can do that,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to get out of their way.
Mm-hmm.
And not talk to them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like saying, I'm just going to marry the right person and then not spend another minute with them. Like, that's not a recipe for a happy marriage. So in many ways, feedback is communication. And no matter who you hire, you've got to communicate, and you've got to communicate well. So, so I think one of the things that I think part of your question was, how can, no matter whether I've hired someone who is the ideal person, or maybe I'm in a situation where I can't hire the ideal person. How can I give feedback in a way that's going to help people succeed? And so I think there's a few ways to think about it. The first is consider the order of operations of radical candor. And this is really important. It doesn't start, radical candor is not about the boss criticizing the employee. I think that's a common misperception. Radical candor starts with soliciting feedback. So don't dish it out until you prove you can take it. So start by asking all of your employees what you could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with you. Because relationships are always two-way streets. And if feedback is, or as I call it in the book, guidance, is it's not a monologue, it's got to be a dialogue. So start by asking for criticism in particular. And when you get it, reward the criticism. You've got to, if you think about it, people take a big risk to criticize you, especially if you're the founder of a company, if you're the boss. And unless you reward that richly, you will never get it again. It's like people also are going to put money in you, in your company, because it's a high risk investment. They're going to expect a big return on their investment. Same thing with criticism. People are going to expect a big return on that investment. So make sure you give them that big return. And so that's number one. Number two is about giving it, and give both praise and criticism. Your job, especially as the founder of a startup, is to paint a picture of what's possible for people and to help them see the vision that is in your head. And praise, it turns out, is a much better tool for that than criticism. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on the good stuff. There's all kinds of research that shows you should give 3 times as much praise, 5 times as much praise, 7 times as much praise. I'm not worried so much about the ratio, but you want to make sure that your praise is really specific and really sincere. Helpful hint, if it's something you would say to a dog, it's not good praise. Good job, not good praise. And then you want to also give criticism. And when you think about how to give criticism, think about these sort of attributes of well, this is actually true for praise and criticism. Think about this in terms of 2-minute impromptu conversations. I'm not talking about some kind of complicated process you have to roll out. These are the things you say in between meetings. The best praise and the best criticism I've ever gotten in my career has happened in walking to the next meeting, right, with somebody. So don't think about it in terms of I've got to save it up for some 360 process, or I got to save it up for a one-on-one. Say it right away. And think about it in terms of being humble. I call it candor and not truth, because to me, candor kind of says, here's what I see. What do you see? It's a conversation. So be humble. State your intention to be helpful. Say it right away. Don't wait. Say it in person. In the meantime, say it over video. 80% of communication, 90% of communication is nonverbal. So you want to offer it in a way that you can see how the other person is responding and adjust how you're talking accordingly. You want to criticize in private, praise in public. And last but not least, make sure that neither your praise nor your criticism is about someone's personality. You want to make sure that you're giving people both praise and criticism about things. In the case of praise, it can be repeated. Criticism, specific things they can change. A really good way to think about it is the Center for Creative Leadership has a model they call situation, behavior, impact. And that's a good way to make sure you're not criticizing someone's personality, but you're talking about something they can change.
Yeah, totally. I love what you said about you need to give praise as well as, candid feedback as well. When you are on the receiving end of these feedback, how do you kind of select which one you're going to make some changes on yourself, and then which one is because of the person said it based on their own personal interests, instead of, actually you are the person who have to do something to change?
So I think when you solicit feedback, you want to make sure, and you disagree with the feedback, you want to make sure you do the following things. First of all, look for the 5 or 10% of what the person said that you do agree with, because you want to show that you're not shut down the feedback. You want to demonstrate that you're not defensive, and give voice to the parts about the feedback that you do agree with. So that's really important. Next, say, for the rest of it, I want to think about it and I want to get back to you. And last but not least, it's really important to get back to the person and to talk to them about why you disagree with their feedback, because ignoring someone has never improved any relationship ever. Right? If you say, thank you for the feedback, then you disagree with it. And that's all you say. What the person hears is F you. So what you want to do is you want to offer a respectful explanation of why you disagree. Disagreements are uncomfortable, but a disagreement that's held with respect can actually improve a relationship. Ignoring what somebody tells you never improves a relationship. So that's kind of what to do when you disagree. How to know when you agree or disagree? There's no, I don't have an algorithm for that. But my advice would be to always be open. And that's why I say wait a day or two before you explain why you disagree. But you will disagree with some feedback. There was one CEO who I was coaching, well-known CEO, and it was sort of my job to gather feedback from the team and make sure that he was hearing it. And he, at one point, he was doing something and the team didn't think he should be doing it. And I told him, and he said, I reject that feedback. Just like instantly. But, which was good. Like sometimes you are going to, but he didn't just ignore the team. He addressed why he was doing what he was doing. And not everybody agreed with him after he explained it, but at least they understood. At least they felt heard. He had sort of made his listening tangible.
So in terms of building these programs to improve, like selecting feedback or giving feedback, from like Radical Candor, the book, to your podcast, to your current platform, and just curious about what do you think is like the most efficient way for a founder to adapt like Radical Candor in their daily work? And because of the pandemic and then a lot of the working situation happening online, so how should they sort of like practice Radical Candor during this kind of situation?
Yeah. It's harder. It's definitely harder now, but it's more important than ever, I think. So one of the things that I would suggest, specific things I would suggest that founders do is keep having one-on-ones with each of your direct reports. And at the end of the one-on-one, solicit feedback. A tweak you might consider making to your one-on-ones with each of your direct reports is to have shorter, more frequent feedbacks. There's something strange has happened to time in this period, which, and like a week seems like a month and a day seems like a minute. I don't know. So I think shorter, more frequent one-on-ones and soliciting feedback in the one-on-ones is important. You want to make sure that you're praising people publicly. I think that's really important. So when you have all hands meetings over Zoom, make sure you're focusing on the good stuff right now. There's so much bad news. And I think for an awful lot of us, at least certainly for me, work is my refuge from all of the terrible news in the world. And so helping people focus on the good things that are happening at work is it's important for the work, but it also is important for people in their lives right now. I think you want to make sure that you're leaving some slack time between, don't book up back to back to back on Zoom, because then you don't have enough slack time in between meetings to pick up the phone and call someone. Ideally, again, a video call, but if you can't do that, at least a phone call, and offer the little impromptu moments of criticism that are part of management. I also think that you want to encourage people to offer radical candor to each other. And one of the best ways that I have found for leaders to do that is to think about that moment in your career when someone told you something that stung a little bit in the moment. And even though it stung a little bit in the moment, it stood you in good stead for the next 10 years. And use that story. Make yourself a little vulnerable, a little human, and use that story to explain the radical candor framework to your team. So in the book, I tell a story about a moment when I was working at Google, when I gave this presentation, and I was so proud of myself. And afterwards, my boss, who was Sheryl Sandberg, told me that I said every third word, and it made me sound stupid. And so this was a cringe moment for me. It was hard for me to hear that, but it really stood me. It was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career. And so when I tell that story, it kind of opens people up to say, this kind of criticism is hard to hear, but it's valuable to hear. So offer that, tell your story to your team. If you want to, we also have developed with Second City, the improv group, a wonderful workplace comedy, which you can buy for your team. And you can watch it together, and it'll help you all understand what radical candor is and what it isn't. The comedy, of course, comes in people getting it wrong. And so it's called Improvising Radical Candor. So check it out. Check out the feedback.
Totally. So I saw on your website, there is services for startups as well as like bigger companies, as well as like in personal development, there was teachable courses. I think it's super interesting. So I would love to learn more about, you started with the book, and then like, where do you want to take it next? You've done like so many things with executives, and curious on where do you see your next step is going to be going?
Yeah. So it's funny. When I wrote the book, when I wrote Radical Candor, part of what inspired me to write it was because I was a CEO coach, and that didn't scale. The goal, of course, is to help people change their behavior, help people. The goal is not just to describe the ideas, but to turn the ideas into realities. And so I thought, well, I could be the coach to, millions of people if I wrote a book and they read the book. And so I thought of the book as the thing that was going to help a lot of people make a change. But of course, then people wanted more. So we tried an app. The app didn't work. If the idea of radical candor is to put your phone in your pocket, look people in the eye, and have a real conversation, the app was kind of a value subtracting round trip. But we found that some of the things that do help are talks, giving talks, doing workshops. Some companies have done book clubs and will join for a Q&A after people read the book. And then part of what we've done is to build this sort of office comedy and this online course that helps people learn in a way that's fun and entertaining, but also educational. We learn when we laugh. So that's another thing we've done. Another thing that's next is one of the things that I'm embarrassed to say I didn't touch on enough in Radical Candor is shortly after the book came out, I was working with a company, and I made an offhanded joke about how Radical Candor was a guerrilla feminist text. And then I realized, why am I being clandestine in a book about candor? What's going on there? And one of the things that people told me in a lot of different ways is that radical candor works really well, but it's easier for white men than for anyone else. And so that really got me to thinking, how can I think about what sort of workplace injustice and how that interferes with radical candor. And that's the topic of the next book, Just Work. Just Work is about sort of how we can break down workplace injustice, how we can distinguish between bias, prejudice, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. All of these things are very different attitudes and behaviors that demand different responses. So how can we distinguish between these things? And what are the things that we can do as leaders, as people harmed, as people who cause harm? Sometimes all of us exhibit these behaviors and attitudes in different ways. And as observers, as how can we become upstanders? So what are the things we can do to interrupt these attitudes and behaviors in the workplace so that we can all just work?
Yeah, so I know we're about to hit the time. I have 3 questions for you. It's a little fire round. One is, who made the biggest impact in your life? And the other one is, who would you invite to your dinner party? And the last one is, beside Radical Candor and Just Work, like what would be a book that you would recommend us to read?
So the biggest impact in my life is my family, my husband and my 2 kids. I think one of the sort of misconceptions about work and life is that it'll be so much harder. This was one of my fears before I had kids, that it'll be so much harder to do the best work of my life when I have to balance. And it turns out I've done the best work of my life after my kids were born. So you can really integrate your work in your life. So I want to give a shout out for that. If I could invite anyone, I would invite Virginia Woolf to my dinner party. I realize she's not alive, but she is my hero. I love Virginia Woolf.
And the last one is like, what's your favorite book beside your own book?
Oh, well, my favorite book is probably Mrs. Dalloway. So written by Virginia Woolf. The 2 are connected. One of the things I would recommend to people is not only reading books about management, but reading novels. I think reading novels really expands your ability to feel empathy for all different kinds of people, and that will make you a better leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can we find you if you're not at work?
If I'm not at work, you can find me. Well, you can find me pretty much the same place all the time right now, which is either in the shed in my backyard or at home. But in times I am out hiking when I'm not at work. I love to be out hiking. Or I'm kind of a homebody.
Same.
I like to, I'll be curled up in bed reading a novel or having a meal with my family or sometimes a dinner party.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show, Kim. I'm so excited to, tell everybody about Just Work.
Thank you. So that is music to a writer's ears. Books are definitely word of mouth. So thank you for spreading the word.
Thanks for tuning into Smart Venture Podcast. If you learned something from the episode or even just mildly tolerated me, please subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. I promise I will keep bringing you more successful, insightful interviews and insider tips about startups. Remember, sharing is caring. So tell your friends to listen too, or enemies, I won't judge. Until next time, keep venturing smartly.